Person watched the reel I did on estrangement and inauthentic connection in Christian families, and they are asking how I would respond to older generation of parents who would maybe look at that epidemic of estrangement and say, well, we never did this, our peers never did this, we honored and respected our parents, so this is a problem of the younger generations, this is on them. First, I would say, well, estrangement's hard to quantify because there's a lot of social stigma and shame around it. Even outside of Christian circles, we prefer our myths. We want the Hallmark movie version of family. And so if people aren't experiencing that, you're not going to know unless they tell you. For a long time, people hid their estrangement in shame. And I do think online connectivity has increased conversation around this. People have found others, they've compared notes. It's maybe removed some of the isolation of that. So first, I'm not so sure that everybody in older generations had intact extended family relationships and nobody was experiencing estrangement. I just don't think that's true. That being said, I do think there are unique dynamics going on in Christian subcultures that play into this. There's been a value around obeying or honoring or respecting parents that goes back for centuries and across cultures. But we see something really unique happening starting around 1970, which is relatively recent, that changes this general idea of obedience or respect into something very specific that I'm going to call in this reel enmeshed Christian parenting. Popular resources that really have a lot of similar themes. They talk about insta obedience, hierarchies in the home that really tie into beliefs in the broader culture about the importance of hierarchy and authority in society and obedience to authority figures. So have corporal punishment as a primary means of securing compliance. And in some of the resources, you have these ideological aims, whether children are arrows to be raised up to reclaim the nation for Christ, or a testimony to ungodly people. Christian families should be a testimony. We talk about all of this at length in our book, but here I want to note that that's not always been the case. I'm going to link in the comment below a reel my co-author Kelsey did, comparing another resource at the time that is an entirely different tone of parenting advice. So I think for many people, particularly those who were formed or shaped by white evangelicalism, they have something very specific in mind when they think of Christian parenting, and their peers doing it are also part of that subculture. But it's not timeless. It's not a timeless Christian way of doing things. It's relatively recent in a number of ways. So in that sense, for this older generation to say, well, is this just something the younger generation is doing? Maybe. These resources explicitly taught a very specific kind of enmeshed parenting, where children really were perceived as extensions of parents, where parents really were told to take on godlike roles of authority, to expect instant compliance. They were told that their worldview, their perspective was the biblical one that followed the instruction manual for life. When all of that combines together, there's no off-ramp for that. The expectation really is that adult children will be on that road that you set them on. As we talked about in the other reel, there's no skill set to deal with differentiation or a different perspective, to tolerate different viewpoints, to accept quote unquote disobedience. A couple of these resources have very small chapters about letting children go. Maybe they give a nod to that, but it's typically with the expectation that that will happen upon marriage. And it all hangs on the leave and cleave verse in Genesis. So there isn't really a meaningful way for that to happen. And certainly when we talk to people, we heard almost universally that was fraught, that even when people got married, there were a lot of expectations still to obey parents, which is kind of interesting because certainly in some of the more high control communities, like for instance, Gothard's family life teaching community, a lot of the parents who entered that did that against the advice of their own parents, right? Like people talk about extended family members who were concerned when they saw their adult children embracing fundamentalism, or were worried about their grandchildren and things like this. Even people who were maybe Christians in mainline traditions who were alarmed to see that. So I also think in some ways, no, the older generation maybe did dishonor their parents in that sense for the reasons they felt were good and right. But a lot of that's going to vary from family to family. So I don't want to like make that too strong of a point, because every family is going to have a unique experience surrounding this. Typically, parents do want to do well by their children. They want to offer them something they didn't have. A lot of times they are making parenting choices in reaction to the way they were parented. It could be that this is something that Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z are doing that is unique to them as younger generations. But that's not too surprising if that's the case. Also, this generation, our generation, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, have new information about the harms of spanking. There have been 50 years of research that we can pull from, that social scientists have done, to say, oh, we can see the harm. We can see that it causes trauma. We can see that it's connected to any number of problems down the road for children, that it wasn't very effective. Hear from adults who are raised in these contexts and say, maybe we need to rethink instant obedience. Maybe that's not a long-term goal. Maybe that's a really short-sighted goal. We can think critically about some of these things, and hopefully it will help to hear that some of them are relatively recent. So we can maybe be done with the myth that says just because you read it in a book published by a Christian publisher, this is some timeless biblical truth. That's simply not the case. I think we can be free of these mindsets that say there's something that's lasted for generations here in these practices. Many of them are very recent. They're very specific to a subculture that had outsized influence because it was ecumenical, because it was a hunter for publishing and media and communications. It was exported globally, often via missionaries and others. So it has an outsized influence, but that does not make it timeless. Because of these enmeshed dynamics, I do think the process of differentiation has been particularly messy in the evangelical subculture because nobody had skills around boundaries, neither parents nor children. And so it is very fraught. Not only did these methodologies give rules that were problematic, they left families bereft of opportunities to practice setting boundaries, respecting others' personhood, communication, skills like that. So I think when young adults or older adults are attempting to differentiate, often it is a very messy process. They're not really sure what to do. Old impulses that you have to figure out the right way to do it can kick in. Still that deep desire to look for someone else to tell you what to do. The reality is navigating these kind of dynamics is a little bit like free fall. And maybe the marker of that shouldn't be, well, what did I or my peers do as an older parent, but is this healthy? And for the Christian, is this aligned with the way and teaching of Jesus?